Great, and you?
I'm doing well. I'm really thrilled that you're joining me today to talk a little bit about diversity in organizational life. Thank you.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. So I know you a lot, and I could attempt to do an introduction for you, but maybe I'll let you do that. Could you begin by telling everyone just a little bit about yourself and your background before we transition into talking a little bit about what you studied through your dissertation research and what you learned?
Absolutely. I am not a native of Nebraska. I'm originally from Iran, and I moved to England at age 12 and learned to speak English and went to school there. And then I moved to the United States when I was 15 to a boarding school. And I graduated from high school and went on to college. I mean, I got my associate's degree when I was 18 and my PhD just a few weeks ago. So I've had a long span in education, but I've taken certainly lots of breaks in between. I'm a mom of two grown sons, a wife to my amazing husband of almost 31 years. My background has been in human resources and healthcare specifically. I have I created a diversity initiative at a health system here in Nebraska, and I worked closely with them and with the community, collaborating with helping create opportunities for diversity to flourish in our community and also in organizations. And um, for probably the last 7 years, I have been teaching on a college level a course on leadership and diversity, and I've conducted research in the past and presently on this specific area. It's a passion of mine from just my personal experiences and my professional work, and just also I feel like it's a calling of what I have been called to do. So.
Thank you. It's definitely no surprise that you're passionate about diversity based on your experiences in your work life. Could you talk a little bit about how those passions and those experiences translated into what you studied through your dissertation research? So, what in particular within the field of diversity did you narrow in for your research study?
Well, I really focused on developing intercultural competence and how that developmental readiness is an important part of leaders being able to succeed uh, in organizational life when they're dealing with people from all walks of life. So my work, my role has not so much been about teaching people specific things about specific cultures as much as it has been about helping people to be cognitively and emotionally ready to address the issues of dealing with people who are different than them. How do we prepare for that? There's the story that really led me into this area was a situation that happened with my father in a hospital room in healthcare. It was 1992. My dad had traveled the world. He was educated. He was spoke multiple languages, and he had had a stroke called locked-in syndrome, which basically means that it was at the base of his brain, and he could hear you and he could comprehend, but he could not speak or move any parts of his body. So he was literally locked into his own body. And my dad, prior to having this stroke, had spoken multiple languages, but at that time, after the stroke, all he could comprehend was Farsi, which is our native tongue. And one day, as I was in his room, a nurse walked in and she wanted help with having me interpret for my father. And as she was leaving the room, she was with another person who she had been training. She said under her breath, "I wish they would learn to speak English. It would make our job so much easier." And something in me triggered, and I didn't realize it at that time, that that was just obviously I was in a highly aroused emotional state because my father was in this difficult situation. but something triggered in me, and my reaction to her um, was not good. I really just chewed her out really bad. But it was at that time that I decided that if, as a country, we say we have excellent health care, how could we have healthcare providers who can judge a patient just based on that short of an encounter and assume that people don't want to learn English or assume that she knew us at that level. And so I basically at that point, from 1992 on, really had it in my heart to change, do whatever I could to change how we prepare healthcare providers. And so when my work came up for my dissertation, my focus was on the topic of how do we prepare healthcare providers. And I had worked with a particular college for a number of years in helping with their diversity initiative. So I knew that we were having an impact, but I really wanted to understand and go a little further as to what was causing some people, because everybody was going through the same training, the faculty, the staff, the students, but not everyone was growing at the same developmental level. And so I wanted to understand what was causing that. What were some of the reasons that that was happening? So I did a mixed methods research, which is both quantitative and qualitative, so interviews as well as data, and in trying to understand what is the impact of what we call psychological capital, which is a person's level of hope, resilience, optimism, and efficacy on their ability to develop. And so that's a very narrow focus in a very vast field and area. And so that was the basis of my research, and that's what I studied. And I believe what I learned can really benefit any organization, especially leaders of organizations.
So, how can some of your key findings be transferable? Meaning, how can they apply to any organization beyond the healthcare field? What do you believe about that?
Well, I believe uh, becoming a leader who can effectively navigate life with people from all walks of life is a developmental process. People don't naturally wake up one morning and go to college and get a bachelor's degree in technical skills or whatever, and then have the natural ability to deal effectively with others who are different than them. I think that we it sounds intuitive that we would, as human beings, have that capacity, but we really don't have that capacity unless we are taught that process. So I believe that that developmental process is, we're able to teach it. We're able to teach it to present and future leaders. We're able to develop that in people. And I also believe that psychological capital, the whole concept of hope and efficacy and resilience and optimism, all of those things are state-like constructs that can be taught to individuals. And the research is coming in every day about various ways that we are learning the impact of psychological capital on organizational effectiveness. And I believe that that is part of what I learned in my study, is that that can have a big impact as well in developing cultural sensitivity.
That's a great lead in to the next question I have for you. So we're working through a textbook in class, and we're reading a chapter on diversity and leadership. And one of the terms that the author explores is cultural awareness. And I'd love to share a short quote with you and maybe have you react to that and speak to how you believe cultural awareness can be taught. So the author says, because cultures are human, symbolic creations, they take many different forms. Cultural teachings result in very different assumptions, expectations, and rules for interactions. If we are not aware of these cultural differences, we can ascribe meanings to behaviors that are inaccurate and divisive. And so I'm curious, based on what you just shared, how does cultural awareness happen in an organization?
Well, we're talking about macro and micro cultural awareness. Cultural awareness on an individual level, it's not doesn't just naturally happen. People don't naturally walk around thinking, "Oh, I'm a cultural being." But we are all, as human beings, are cultural beings because we are socialized by the many elements and many facets of our life as to how to behave and be and exist and succeed in our various environments. So we're taught from the time we're very young, good girls and boys do these things. So we're taught this is how you exist in this environment. Then, that's what our parents teach us. Boys do this and they do this, and girls do this and they do that. And if you're honest, you are saying this and doing this. And so these are all the teachings that we're getting our entire life. And so if we consider ourselves as human beings as being cultural beings, we have culture. Becoming aware of it is like peeling back the layers. How have I been acculturated? What did I learn from my family? What did I learn from my school? What did I learn from my places of worship? What did I learn from, the difficulties that I've experienced in my life? Have they taught me? So that's the micro level. Each person has their own level, multiple layers of culture that is operating within them. So becoming aware of that takes work. And I use the construct in the classroom I teach. I use the construct of emotional intelligence and diversity. It's from the Emotional Intelligence and Diversity Institute. And really, it looks at what they title it is affirmative introspection, which is how do I look at myself in a way that positively sheds light on the multiple ways that I have been socialized. And so that's one thing that every individual needs to be doing on an ongoing basis if they are to gain cultural awareness. Then when we come together in an organization, we create a culture in our organization based on who we are. What is the purpose that we're coming together? A school has a different culture than, say, a hospital because their purpose is different. The language is different. The approaches are different. There are some similarities because there are some similarities between human beings. But how I operated in a hospital as a administrative person in a hospital was very different than how I operate in a college classroom. And so recognizing that those unwritten rules and the language and the way we dress and how we interact and meeting times and how we resolve conflict, the politics of the organization, all of those things are part of the culture of the organization. So we become aware again by peeling back the layers. And peeling back the layers always begins with observation and self-reflection. Does that answer your question?
No, it really does. And I appreciate the focus on self-reflection. Um, and also I heard you talk about the community too. And so I'm wondering if you could take a minute to expand on that a little bit to talk about how leaders in an organization might facilitate some of that happening. I can imagine there are very organized curriculums and processes that one could explore, but do you have any insight into just basics of how leaders can help facilitate environments where those things happen?
Well, I think great leaders are great learners, right? That's just one of the philosophies I have about leadership. People who lead well are the ones who are willing to learn. They're constantly learning. And so one of the ways that leaders can facilitate that development is by creating a learning environment in the organization, whatever that looks like, whether there's books that we read and we talk about, whether there's 10 minutes during a meeting where we just say, okay, so what's happening in your life before we start the meeting, and what's going on, and how are you being supported, how are you not being supported. That lends itself to that self-reflection piece. It gives opportunity for self-reflection to happen on a daily basis in everything that we're doing. And so I think learning type of organizations tend to be more successful at that, and the leaders who recognize that learning is an important aspect of ongoing human growth and their journey in life naturally create environments that do that. And I don't think it has to be something that is we it's in a box, we did it, we can check it off. I think it becomes a natural part of everything that we do, everything that we weave in, the conversations that we have in our organizations, and the stories that we tell about our organization, the stories that we tell about ourselves. All of those things come into play, and I think leaders can facilitate that.
Those are great insights. So there's definitely quite a few differences between leadership and management and administration. In our book, one of the authors cites a person named Taylor Cox, who notes that managing diversity is one of the biggest pieces of being a manager or a leader in modern organizational life. Can you react to that a little bit? Can diversity be managed? What does managing diversity look like?
Well, I'm not going to pretend to know what Taylor Cox was thinking when he said managing diversity, but there's lots of different beliefs as to what managing diversity is. Some people, where a person is developmentally obviously has a lot to do with how they react or feel about that word managing. So for some people, managing diversity is like herding cats and bringing them together so that they can do one thing. For another person, managing diversity is about creating synergy, taking all of those differences and saying, how do we create something that is greater than the sum of all its parts? So that is what I consider to be managing diversity, is that my role as a leader, and I totally agree that there is a difference between a leader and a manager. A leader is who you are, a manager is someone who manages a process, right? And so I believe as a leader, my responsibility is to create an environment that accepts differences, that is excited about differences, that is energized by the fact that someone's work style is different than my work style, that their approach to solving problems is different than my style. So if I am that kind of a leader, then I'm creating synergy to exist through diversity in my organization. However, if I feel like people should all do things the way that it's been laid out, and we should communicate it the exact same way to everyone, and people don't need to veer away from that, to me, that's more of a herding cats approach to diversity. And that tends to result in negative outcomes, in my experience, having worked in this field for a number of years. Because people, human beings, in my experience, don't want to be herded. We hire people for their talents, and then we bring them in and sadly treat them like kindergarten students. It's like, this is how I want it done, this is how you're going to do it, this is when you're going to do it, and this is what you're going to do, as opposed to saying, our end goal is this, what are your thoughts on how to get there? Does that make sense, or does that answer the question?
It does. I really appreciate how you use the phrase cultural synergy several times. While you can't, do a bird's eye view into every organization in southeast Nebraska, mid-sized town city, but if you could, how would you describe cultural synergy in our part of Nebraska? What does that look like, whether that's Lincoln or Omaha?
Hmm. I think cultural. from a community standpoint, not an organizational standpoint, is what I'm hearing you ask. Is that correct?
Yes. Actually, maybe I'll let you respond to both layers,
Okay.
and we can think about how those dynamics may or may not differ.
Okay. So, from a community standpoint, and I've gone into communities where they've had a large influx of a particular population. Lexington, Nebraska, Madison, Nebraska, different parts of Grand Island, different parts of the state where I've gone in and because of a meat packing plant or farming or something, we see an increase in uh, Latina population or African, uh, new arriving African populations, or Middle Eastern, or even individuals who arrived back in the 80s, some who continue to arrive from Vietnam. So we, one of the ways that we are not creating synergy in a community is when we say everyone has to speak English. And while I recognize all of us speaking the same language has its merits and benefits, I think it also needs to be balanced with the natural fact that it takes human beings 7 to 10 years, adults, 7 to 10 years to learn another language. And so when we are in a community that is valuing that cultural synergy, what we're doing is we are recognizing that people are all at different stages of English capability. We create systems to both support learning and support that. While I'm learning, I need help with something else. So from a hospital standpoint, I'll give you an example. People go and learn English. At least when I was learning English, I never learned the answer to the question, when was your last menstrual cycle? When was your last bowel movement? I didn't learn those kinds of things. But when I go into the hospital or when I go into the doctor's office, those are some common questions, correct? So someone may be learning English, but they don't quite have that depth of knowledge of English. So in a synergistic community, what we're doing is we're creating opportunities for people to learn English, but at the same time, we're providing interpreters in areas that we know there's specialization, as opposed to saying, I'm sorry, you're here, you learn English, and you show up to our hospital or our doctor's office knowing this stuff. Okay? That would be I'm giving you the opposite ends of the spectrum in a community. In an organization, that can look very similar. And actually, this happened with a group of employees that we had, that we basically had a policy that employees should speak English in front of patients, which makes sense. As much as possible, we would like for people to feel like they're included. We're creating an inclusive environment, so we want to give you opportunity for inclusion. But then we also recognize how difficult and exhausting it is to be speaking a different language all the time when you're in the process of learning it. So we basically said that if people are on their breaks and at their lunchtime, or before work, after work, they could speak their native tongue as a way to relax the brain, relax the body, just be comfortable. Again, that's, in my opinion, what synergy looks like, versus in an organization life, the policy would be to write anyone up anytime we heard them speaking a different language other than English.
That's helpful. All of those descriptions are really helpful to the big picture. I have one last question for you for our time together, and I'll give you a little backstory before I ask the question. In our textbook, the author shares a case study about a non-Western worldview called Taoism. And essentially, the title of the case study focuses on the question, can non-Western principles of leadership be transferable to leaders with Western worldviews? And essentially, one of the core tenets of Taoism is, as you lead, you lead when not only you are strong, but also when you are weak, and especially in many cases, sometimes when you are weak. So, my question is, do you believe that Western thinkers, all of us in the United States, can we learn from non-Western philosophies of leadership, and what could that look like for us?
I believe it's essential for us to learn because we're in a global community. So if I recognize that I have been socialized by a Western style of leadership, and knowing that others are socialized by a different type of leadership based under different tenets, so Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, I mean just different tenets, and these are religions that I'm talking about. But even the concept of locus of control, very much in Western societies, the locus of control is within me. If anything is going to happen, there's a quote in or a proverb in American culture that says, "If it's to be, it's up to me." So that's the locus of control is within me. Whereas in other cultures, the locus of control is outside of me. And religion tends to drive that. Something bigger than me is operating outside. I can do my part, but I can't control all of the situations. Correct? And so if I am only operating with my own philosophy and believe that to be the only way, I will run into problems when I'm working with people whose philosophies are very different than myself. So I believe in order for us to be successful, it's essential that we not only become aware of what the author is sharing, but we also recognize how my philosophy can be in opposing ways to other people's philosophy, and how that can create a block for us to be effective unless we're willing to create a bridge to be effective.
Wonderful. Helen, thank you for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. I really appreciate you sharing your insights with us, and I hope the rest of your day goes really well.
Thanks for having me, Vanessa, and I hope that the class goes well and that this was beneficial to everyone.